So today's conversation is trauma, parenting, and challenging behaviors for school-age children. Something that we're very excited about specifically with this conversation is that it's being brought to us by Dr. Melissa Bernstein. She is a returning facilitator, a returning subject matter expert who is having this conversation with you today. And here's a fun fact. Did you know that Dr. Melissa Bernstein, actually, Melissa, if you would please advance me to the next slide, best known as Dr. Melbourne on Twitter. Did you know that Melissa was our very first presenter with Caltrin back in 2001 when we hosted our very first webinar? She was our first presenter, and every time we have her back, it is a treat. We are so grateful. I want to tell you just a little bit about Melissa, and then we're going to jump right into this conversation. In her role at Rady Children's Hospital, San Diego, Dr. Melissa Bernstein directs the Advancing California's Trauma-Informed Systems, ACTS, and the Trauma-Informed Licensing Team, TILT, initiatives. Her work centers around supporting systems in planning for, implementing, and sustaining trauma-informed change that aligns with best practice and science. If you had a chance to join the Chadwick conference this year, you would have seen Melissa as one of the incredible dynamic speakers that she is, and we are so grateful to have her back. So thank you so much for being with us. We're looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Jess. I wish I could take you around with me everywhere. That was such a nice introduction. I really appreciate that. So in addition, just a little bit about me, in addition to the fun work I get to do here at Rady Children's Hospital at the Chadwick Center or the ACTS and TILT project, I'm also a clinical psychologist and I see kiddos. I specialize in working with kids with disruptive behavior and kids who've experienced trauma. So some of the information I'm sharing, of course, comes from the science, but also my own experience doing this work with kiddos and families. So really excited to be here to be presenting on this topic with you guys today. As helping professionals, dealing with behavior problems can be challenging enough on its own. Then we're adding this element of a child and a family who's gone through such a scary event, like a traumatic experience, which just makes it that much more difficult. So today I'm really going to be focusing on sharing some evidence-based approaches and skills and tips and tools that we can use to support families who are really dealing with some challenging behaviors on top of that trauma experience. So I'm going to use the word caregiver throughout the presentation. Just know that that refers to really any adult that's taking care of that kiddo that you're working with. So it can be a biological parent, it could be a resource or foster caregiver, kinship caregiver, things like that. This topic is also kind of information heavy, so I really do invite you all to ask questions again through that Q&A as we go through, but also please feel free to use the chat for conversation as we go through the presentation. Okay, so in our time together today, I'd like to just start off by talking a bit about what happens after a trauma, spend some time talking about what's going on, how can we figure out what's going on, a little bit about assessment, spend a bit of time talking about how we work and connect and join with caregivers, and then talk about some of those strategies that can help shape behavior. Okay, but first, let's make sure we're all on the same page. So we're talking about behavior problems, challenging behaviors for school-age kids. So when we talk about school-age kids, we're talking about kiddos from the ages of around 6 to 12. So when you think about the families that you serve in whatever capacity, in whatever role, when you think about behavior problems or disruptive behavior, what kind of behaviors are you thinking about? What kind of behaviors come to mind? And you can just throw those in the chat so we can kind of all see what we're talking about here. So hitting, physical aggression, that's definitely a really, really big one that is really disruptive for families. A lot of times it's very unacceptable behavior for families, absolutely. Verbal aggression, so we hear that like yelling, maybe cursing, tantrums, so just that like breaking down, these big behaviors, disobedience or oppositionality, spitting, classroom disruption, so we see the behavior. Sometimes it's just in the home, sometimes it's just in the classroom, but often, especially when we're talking about kids who've experienced trauma and there's all that dysregulation, we see this, challenging behavior in all different environments. Lying, we see withdrawing, so like not engaging in things they used to. Sometimes we see those more serious self-injurious behaviors like cutting, absolutely. Destruction of property, right? So destruction of property and aggression, those are typically those behaviors that are not acceptable. You guys can keep going, but you definitely, I think we're on the same page here. Inattention, hyperactivity, shutting down, absolutely. So when we're talking about disruptive behaviors, challenging behaviors, these are exactly the things we're talking about. Great. Okay, so I'd like to start before we kind of dive into what to do, just start with kind of what's probably a bit of review for you all, but just to kind of level set us and make sure we're kind of keeping that trauma-informed mindset and that hat on when we're thinking about all of these really big, frustrating, and overwhelming behaviors that we're trying to support caregivers around. So thinking about kiddos who have experienced trauma, what happens after that trauma, you know, we're all probably very familiar with the fight, flight, freeze response, right? It's our body's alarm system. It's telling us what to do when there's danger. And we know that after a trauma, that body's alarm system, our nervous system, our stress hormones, all of that is pretty out of whack, right? When something innocuous happens, that maybe isn't danger, that maybe isn't a safety concern, our body's alarm system is responding like it is, right? So for kids who experience a trauma, they're kind of pushed at the playground, maybe by accident, but that nervous system, that alarm system is going off and they're responding. And so we want to remind ourselves what children who have experienced a trauma might be going through, right? Not all kids, but for many kids, there's that like hypersensitive nervous system, that alarm system that's hypersensitive. And so I think it's helpful for us as helping professionals just to keep that in our minds when we're thinking about all of these really big behaviors, but also for us to keep in mind when we're working with caregivers to make sure that they understand that this is happening for those kiddos. I think can really be helpful to kind of shift to that kind of empathetic understanding. Okay, so we know fight, flight, freeze happens. We know that it's something that kids have a really difficult time controlling after a trauma. And so as helping professionals, we want to know, when is that happening, right? When is that kid being triggered? When are they in that fight, flight, freeze? So that we know how to help caregivers in responding. The truth is it's really hard. It's really hard to know, and you're never going to get it 100%. I think, you know, you guys completed those surveys, asking some pre-questions before coming to this training, and a lot of folks wrote in never-ending triggers. How do we know? And just being honest, it is kind of challenging to know because the trauma is so unique for every child. There can be triggers that are very unique to that kiddo. There are some that we're going to know, maybe a certain date, a certain place, a certain individual, but there's lots that we don't know. So these are just some clues that a child might be in that fight, flight, freeze response, that their body's alarm system has been triggered. So it might look like these really extreme emotions. So all of a sudden they're at the dinner table and then boom, like they're screaming, they're crying, you're like, where is this coming from? So a lot of times it's how it feels. Caregivers will report, you know, it feels like it came out of the blue. There's just this huge emotional response to this really little thing that happened. And I don't even know what's going on. It really happens really quickly. Oftentimes the kiddo was unable to calm down when a caregiver or a teacher or a helping professional will try to reason with that kid. If the behavior gets even bigger, there's just, you can tell that that kid is really in distress. And again, often by something kind of innocuous. That distress might last kind of a long time. And then sometimes what happens is later that kiddo might come and feel a little bit of shame about that behavior because it feels out of their control. So these are some kind of clues and cues to let us know, I wonder if this is maybe a trauma reaction. And we'll talk through a little bit about specific strategies we can use when we're specifically seeing that fight, flight, freeze response. Okay, but we still want more tools to be able to understand what's going on with that kiddo. So we've got a little bit of knowledge about what a trauma response might look like. It's not 100%, but we've got some support there. but we really also want to know what is going on with the families that we're trying to help. I really believe that this is one of the first steps in helping caregivers to manage these challenging behaviors that you all mentioned. There's a lot of different tools, but I'm just going to highlight this one kind of assessment strategy, if you will, that we can use with caregivers. This might be familiar to some folks. For other folks, it might be new. For me, I know sometimes I try and like skip this step and just get to problem solving, but it's really, really important that we spend that time in the beginning with a caregiver, really trying to understand what's going on so that we can direct them to the best support and the best tool. So it's a bit of a busy slide. Don't feel like you have to read it all, but let's just focus on the top here. So the ABCs, I call it. So the behaviors, which is where we always start. The antecedents is what comes before the behavior, and the consequences are what comes after the behavior. So we'll start at B, the behavior. So a parent comes in and they're saying, you know, my child's acting crazy. They're out of control. They're off the wall, which I hear a lot. And so for me as a helping professional, I'm like, okay, really don't know what that looks like. I kind of get it, but I'm not really sure what exactly we're talking about. So we always want to make sure that it's really clear what behavior we're going to be working on. So I might say to that caregiver, you know, please, you know, let's paint me a picture. Help me understand exactly what we're talking about here. What does that look like? I really want to know all about it. And so they'll let me know, you know, Lisa is taking toys from her brother's room and hiding them. Okay, now we're on a roll. It's a lot more helpful than my child acting crazy. Now I kind of know maybe where I want to go. Then I want to know, you know, more about the behavior. When's it happening, right? Is it happening all the time? Is there a certain time the behavior is happening? Is it happening every day? Is it happening on the weekends? That can really help me to figure out what strategies we're going to use. So it turns out this kiddo is taking toys from her brother's room at nighttime before it's her bedtime. Okay, so now I have a lot of information. Maybe it's attention seeking. What can I do to help keep her involved during nighttime? But the more we can figure out and understand the behavior, the more specific our support can be. I think for caregivers coming in, it's really overwhelming when you have a kiddo at home that is hyperactive or inattentive or cursing, being oppositional, being defiant. It could just feel like it's this huge thing that's happening. And so the more that we can help narrow it down for them and be very specific, the more regulating it is for those caregivers too. So that's the first step in really understanding what is the behavior that we're trying to help. Another helpful thing is to figure out, okay, what's going on before the behavior is happening? Because that can give us a lot of direction as well. So I'll take one of your examples. Someone said cursing. So let's say a parent comes in and the kid is cursing and being mean to other kids, let's say at a bus stop, right? So at the bus stop, mom's getting a lot of complaints or dad's getting a lot of complaints that this kid's cursing and kind of bullying or being mean to other kids. So we know the behavior, we know the specifics. I wonder what's happening before. So I might sit down with those caregivers and say, okay, tell me before you're going to the bus stop, what's happening? What does it feel like in the home? What are you saying? What's the kids saying? What's leading up to it? Have there been any big changes in that morning routine in the house? And so maybe we learn, actually dad used to take the kid to school, but we just got divorced. And so now he has to take the bus. Okay, that's so helpful information for me to know as a helping professional where I want to go with that family, right? Before I might just say, maybe it's attention seeking, maybe it's this, but now I kind of have a sense of what's going on. So again, really important to try and figure out what's going on before the behavior happened, because maybe that's the place I want to intervene. Before the behavior, this antecedent, that's a great place to intervene. If we can intervene here before the behavior happens, that's really useful. The last area is consequences. So we want to also understand what's happening after the behavior occurs, right? So example, I think someone said interrupting. So kiddos interrupting at school, maybe throwing things, maybe running around the classroom. Teacher has had enough and caregivers don't know what to do. So I want to know, tell me, I know the behavior, I know what's happening maybe before the behavior, what's happening after. What do you do? What do you say? What's your reaction? What's the school's reaction? Sounds like mom has to pick him up because he can't stay in the classroom. So when this behavior happens, mom picks him up, and he leaves school and he goes to work with mom and kind of like sits in a corner. That's really helpful to know. Like maybe that's really reinforcing that mom gets to pick him up from school. So maybe we want to intervene at the consequences stage. So this kind of assessment is really helpful for us, and I think really helpful for caregivers too. I like to approach it like I'm a detective. Like I really don't know what's going on, and the more you can tell me, the more I can help. I think it's also helpful for caregivers to try and put those patterns and pieces together. And again, if you guys have questions, I know it's a lot of information I'm sharing. I wish I could hear your voices, but please feel free to throw things in the chat. If I move on too quickly and you have questions about anything that I go over, throw them in and we can talk about them. Okay. So we've got our kind of assessment phase. We really want to make sure that we're doing due diligence and spending our time in the beginning, really understanding what the behavior that we're talking about is. One question that I ask that I find to be really helpful, especially when caregivers come in very overwhelmed and there's a lot going on, I get a little overwhelmed. I'm like, oh gosh, where do I start? Sometimes I ask, if you had a magic 8-ball or a wand and you can choose one behavior that we could like fix right now, that would be out of your hair, that would be out of the home, which behavior would it be? And that's typically a really good place to start. So that can be helpful too if we're feeling like there's a lot going on with this family. So after the assessment phase, this is kind of the next kind of step where I would move into and working with a family where a kiddo has experienced trauma and they're experiencing some behavior problems. It's working with caregivers. When we talk about challenging behaviors in school-age children, we're talking about working with caregivers, right? So before we kind of dive into joining and working and aligning with caregivers, I'd love to hear from you all in the chat. What are some of the challenges you all experience in working with caregivers around challenging behaviors? You guys shared such interesting and insightful answers in the kind of pre-survey. So I just love for everyone to hear some of those. So again, in the chat, if you could just put some of the challenges you guys have when you're working with caregivers, whether it be, it's my kiddo, I don't want to, whatever it is. Caregivers are overwhelmed and stressed out. Absolutely. It's really hard to work with folks, as we know, when we're overwhelmed and stressed out. Well, they're coming in hot here. Hold on. I'm going to try and get all these. Not wanting to put in the work to change the behavior. Absolutely. So, here's my kiddo, fix them. It's their issue. It's their problem. Like, this isn't about me. I definitely hear that attitude a lot. There's a lack of time. I have got 3 kids. I'm full-time mom. Maybe I'm a single parent. It's really hard for me to spend time, trying out new things or attending to these needs. Absolutely. Expecting the intervention to work overnight. Absolutely. So, okay, you told me to do this. It didn't work. I'm done. That's absolutely true. Again, we see timing here, unrealistic expectations. Absolutely. So we're hearing a lot of the same ones: frustrated, fix my kid, unrealistic expectations, maybe a lack of engagement. Again, caregivers are tired, they're busy. Absolutely. These are really wonderful. Maybe they feel threatened by our help, right? Maybe there's that relationship. You're the expert. Absolutely. Being burnt out, lack of patience. Great job. You can keep putting them in there, but I think you guys definitely hit the nail on the head. These are, I think, challenges that we all experience, and challenges that honestly can be a huge barrier to helping kids with challenging behavior and kids after trauma. And so if we don't address this barrier, the likelihood of us making real change with kids is going to be low. And so I think a huge part of working with challenging behavior is working with caregivers and making sure we're spending that time to understand those expectations and support them as much as we can. So let's talk about how to do that. So these are some things you might hear. I think you guys already did a great job saying them in the chat, but we hear things like my child's completely out of control, I'm at my wit's end, I can't take it anymore. I often hear, I've tried everything and nothing works. I think I hear that probably every time. Maybe there's that one time you get that caregiver that's like, oh, I'm really open to hearing your suggestions. Those unrealistic expectations, right? Ugh, this kid's just going to end up in juvie anyway. They're going to fail out of school. Like, I'm just like, what's the point anymore, right? And so this is, I think my first question was like, this is more of like a softball question. It's a little bit harder, but I'm going to throw it out there and see where we go with it. So when we hear this, when we're hearing these kind of themes or expectations or feelings and emotions and perspectives from caregivers, where do we go first? Like, how do we want to respond? What should we do? You can just throw that in the chat and see where we go. Okay, so I'm seeing validating. Great job, everyone. Absolutely. That's definitely a really helpful first step. Great. Empathize, validating, definitely. Listening, understanding those feelings, try to be as understanding as possible. Absolutely. Providing compassion, great job. Checking our own triggers and trauma responses, absolutely. That is so important and can be so difficult for us to do sometimes. Educate. So there's a lot of different tools that I'm hearing, right? Empathy, educating, being supportive, checking our own responses, providing solutions. There's a lot here. And so I just want to talk about maybe like the ordering and kind of where we can go with that. Okay. So I think firstly, as you guys mentioned, it's that validation. It's creating space for caregivers to share their concerns and to share those really unpopular thoughts they might be having. If we don't create space for that, they're just going to come up later, right? So a lot of times we'll hear things like, honestly, I can't even stand my kid right now. And for them to be able to say that to us and for us to be like, yeah, I understand. A lot of parents feel that way. Is very helpful. They might be feeling a lot like, oh, I can't share that with them, or this provider will never understand how bad it is. I think that's a lot of how caregivers feel often because maybe they haven't been heard in the past. So making sure we're spending that time creating space to hear those kind of those thoughts and being able to normalize and empathize and validate those for folks is always the first place to begin. I think personally for me, sometimes that can be hard. I feel, I want to help. I feel a responsibility to help. And so I might want to jump in with some problem solving. Oh, I know this great tool. Let's try it. But I do think if we skip this step, it will come back to bite us later. So just trying to remind ourselves to create space for this kind of joining with caregivers in the beginning is really important. I think someone mentioned it in the chat, but empathy sounds great, but it is also harder than it seems sometimes. Someone mentioned maybe a caregiver's using a lot of profanity, being really unempathetic towards their kid. They are only using consequences. They really don't seem interested in learning anything new. Honestly, that can be kind of hard to align with as a helping professional. But taking that time to check in on our own biases, on our own thoughts and feelings, and trying to drum up something that we feel we can connect with this caregiver around is definitely worth that time. So this work is also checking in with ourselves and our own reactions to the caregivers we're working with and being honest about those reactions as well, so that we can be prepared on how to align in a way that's genuine. So that's really helpful. And I think communicating a message of hope, which we'll talk a little bit about how to do. I think a lot of times caregivers don't have a lot of hope that these behaviors can change. Oftentimes I like to, again, we're talking about kids who've experienced trauma. I like to talk about that a lot of the behaviors that you're seeing in your kiddo are learned behaviors. These aren't innate. We aren't born with that behavior. And maybe they learned them through living through a really challenging or unsafe experience or being modeled things that weren't helpful for them. And so they've learned these behaviors that we're seeing. And because they're learned, that means they can be unlearned and they can be replaced. So not all hope is lost. So providing some psychoeducation around what's happening and the behavior problems that you're seeing, if there's ADHD there, if there's anxiety or depression, providing psychoeducation around why we might be seeing some of these behaviors and that they're learned really does help provide a sense of hope for caregivers that this kiddo is not just a bad kid, right? That something has happened and they're trying to keep themselves safe. And maybe that's one of the reasons why we're seeing some of these big behaviors. Again, we're kind of shifting that and starting to provide that psychoeducation to empathize, but we'll talk more about that. Talk more about it right now. So psychoeducation, it's a really good tool to, again, help caregivers start to understand maybe where these behaviors are coming from and maybe start to soften in some of the perspectives that they have. Again, rightly so, we're seeing these kids for an hour and usually I'm exhausted after. So imagine like living with kiddos who are having really difficult behaviors. Again, just understanding where those caregivers are coming from. But providing psychoeducation can be really helpful. So things like asking permission. Again, someone mentioned the relationship between the caregiver and the therapist or the helping professional. Our job is to open up space for them so that it can feel a little bit more balanced. So would it be all right if I told you some things that have worked for other parents, right? So oftentimes I hear, I've tried everything and nothing works. This is a really good response to that. Wow, I hear that you are so dedicated to helping your kiddo. You've tried a lot of things and you spent a lot of time working on trying to have your child behave and follow instructions and have that best behavior. And it sounds like that's been really frustrating and not a lot's working. I wonder if it's okay if I share with you some other tools. They might work, they might not, that have helped for other parents. That can be, again, kind of a way in there. Clarifying if there's an information gap. What do you already know? What do you know about coping skills? What do you know about, these tools that I've been talking about? Is there any information that you need that might be helpful for you? So really wanting to understand there's information that maybe they'd like to learn about. And then again, what have they done in the past? So tell me about the things that you've tried. Okay, you've tried timeout. Tell me why it hasn't worked. How did you do it? Oh, okay, that's really helpful for me to know. So again, just kind of making sure they feel heard. Some of the tools and strategies that we'll be talking about today, it might feel like they don't match the large intensity of the problem. And so if caregivers don't feel like we hear how bad it is, they'll be like, what are you telling me to do? That's silly. So really spending time making sure they know that we understand the severity of the problem and providing them some psychoeducation around it can be really helpful. Clarifying language can be helpful to use. Does that make sense? What else would you like me to know? Here's what I know. Tell me, how does that apply to you and your family? Again, common sense things that probably we all intuitively know as helping professionals, but can sometimes be lost when these big behaviors are coming and there's maybe safety risks involved and we really just want to get to fixing it. Okay. So that's kind of that first piece, is this joining with caregivers and really working to make sure caregivers feel supported, you feel aligned, we understand the behavior. Now we can focus on, okay, what tools can I provide as a helping professional to these caregivers to help them with these big behaviors? So these are some kind of strategies that we can use. I mentioned before, I think of these as a big toolbox that I can have. And I talk to caregivers like that. Like there's a lot of things that I know. I'm going to be sharing those things with you. Some of them might work, some of them might not, right? I think you guys mentioned in the chat before this idea about expectations. So we want to let them know the expectations right up front. Every kiddo is different. Every family is different. I have a set of tools that work for families, but some might work for you, some might not. We're here together. I'm here to help you figure out what works. That way, if something doesn't work, it's not all is not lost. We have other things that we can try. All right, so let's get into some of those strategies. I kind of divvied it up in these 4 areas. So after a child goes through a traumatic experience, we do see that they tend to struggle with these areas of child development, right? So things like attachment, self-regulation, self-efficacy, and social connectedness. And we'll talk about, what these are and what these look like. Just keeping in mind that these are skills that are learned and developed over time. And so for kids who have experienced trauma, what we know is that development can be interrupted, right? And so helping, again, caregivers to understand that can be really helpful. We'll go over what that disruption might look like for these areas and then what tools we can offer. Okay, so the first area is this area of attachment. So children are hardwired to attach, right? That is innate in us. However, attachment doesn't just happen. Kids need to receive a range of emotional support from their caregivers, from the adults around them, in order to develop that skill, because it is a skill, right? And at that core of those, emotional supports around attachment is the support of safety and security. That's really kind of the fundamental feature of attachment, that kids feel the safety and security. So attachment is this like bi-directional relationship. It has to happen in two directions. So for kids who have experienced a trauma, not all, but sometimes their attachment relationship has been impacted. So the people who were supposed to keep them safe and secure to help build that attachment didn't do so, and they were hurt, right? And so what's going to happen is that attachment relationship for those kiddos is going to be impacted. I think it's a really empathetic way to look at why these kiddos might be having these relationship difficulties, why that trust isn't there, right? It makes sense. Maybe they weren't modeled that. And so we want to make sure our caregivers and ourselves as helping professionals are understanding where this is coming from. So let's take an example. You're working with a family and you kind of notice that the relationship is pretty strained, which isn't too much of a stretch. I think we see this in a lot of families we work with. I would say this is anecdotal, not from the science, so don't quote me. I don't have a citation here. But I would say maybe from the families that I work with, I would say about 80% of them come in and this is where we're starting. This is what's happening. Sometimes the relationships are really strong, it's really great, and we can kind of jump somewhere else. But a lot of the time we're seeing that kind of strain in the relationship between the caregivers and the kiddo. There might be a lot of yelling, a lot of no's, stop, don't do that, a lot of raised voices from both caregivers and kiddos, a lot of defiance, like no matter what I say, no matter what I do, even if it's like positive, they're just not listening. And maybe that caregiver feels kind of unempathetic at this point to this kiddo. So we have this kind of strained relationship here. So what's happening? I think it's helpful sometimes to go over this as kind of a psychoeducation piece with caregivers. The first is understanding that attachment piece and trauma. And then this, I think this kind of cycle, it's what we call a coercive cycle, I think is true for any kiddo and caregiver, even if they have or have not gone through a traumatic experience. But helping caregivers understand what this cycle is, I think can help understand how they're going to break it. So what does it look like? So a parent gives a command, turn off the TV, it's time for bed. Kiddo's like, no, like just 5 more minutes, please. Like, no, it's a really good show. Caregiver's like, what did I say? It's time for bed. I've said it a million times. No, that's not fair. Like last night I got to stay up even longer. It doesn't matter. I've already told you this. We're not doing this every night. And as you can see, it keeps escalating, right? Child escalates, caregiver escalates until something happens, until the caregiver is like, whatever, I can't deal with this anymore. Watch TV, go to bed whenever you want. Or the child finally shuts off the TV. But no one really wins in this situation because it's a really stressful situation. Oftentimes when I share this cycle with caregivers, they're like, yes, that's what's happening. And if I'm really honest with them, it's not the kiddo who's going to break this cycle. It's going to be you as the adult. It's going to be you as the caregiver. So that can kind of sometimes shift, again, not always, but I noticed in the chat, one of the challenges might be, like fix my kid, like take them, please. It's not my responsibility. I think this can be helpful sometimes to go over with caregivers to show that the kiddo is not going to break this cycle. It's going to have to be the adult in the room that's going to break that. And so let's talk about how we can do that. Again, thinking about the relationship and the attachment. Okay, so I'm hoping that I've primed this caregiver enough for this strategy to land. But the first one is kind of catching them being good. Other people have talked about it as labeled praise, right? So again, we've got this stressed out parent, kids acting out. The language in the home a lot of the time are going to be like, don't do this, don't do that, stop, no. And so what we want to do is we want to balance out that language. We want to balance out that negative with some positive interactions. So how I talk about it with caregivers is we're going to try and catch that kiddo being good. They might be like, there's nothing to praise. There's nothing good happening. So what can I do? So I want that caregiver to think about the behavior that really bothers them the most. And then we want to think about what the opposite is, right? And then we want to douse that kid with praise when that's happening. So if we're working with a family where the kiddo is really impulsive and just kind of grabs at things all the time, it's driving mom nuts. Every time that kid waits patiently or is just standing there not grabbing something, it's a party. We want to be really specific. We want to douse them in praise. We want to catch them being good, right? So what can that sound like? It can sound like very specific praise. So these are some common behaviors. You guys mentioned all of these in the chat before. Common areas that parents will come in and say, this is driving me nuts. What can I do? The relationship is not very strong. This is where we want to begin. And we want to begin this, I'll just take a step back for a second, because if we start with consequences, if we start with timeout, if we start with taking away things, if we start with punishment, the likelihood of that being successful is very small. So this is highly supported by the literature. One of the strongest results we have when you look at the literature around evidence-based behavioral strategies for kids who have challenging behavior or disruptive behavior is positive supports first. That is going to be so helpful. We want to fill up that piggy bank with positive so that when we take something away, there's something to take away, that they're listening to us, right? If we think about ourselves, you think about like a boss you've had, you think about like the best boss you've had, you're more likely to listen to them when they're going to tell you to do something. Whether if you have that difficult relationship with your boss and you're just kind of over it, the likelihood of you following through if there's no consequences is lower. And so having that positive relationship and building in some positivity is really essential if we're going to provide consequences, if we're going to think about using some of those punishment consequence strategies later on. So back to the praise, ways to do that. So if you're noticing opposition or maybe the kid's being angry, what I want to instruct parent to do is every time you see them being patient, you want to praise them. So you're doing so well at being patient. I'm so proud of you for using your words. I'm so proud of you for cooperating, whatever language they want to use. What's the behavior? What's the opposite? And how can we praise as much as possible? So if the kiddo's hyperactive, that's awesome. You're being so polite. You're using your indoor voice so well. Way to keep your hands to yourself. And I often assign it as homework for caregivers to just try out and practice for the week. So before you see me next time, this is all I want you to do. This week, I really just want you to try and catch that kiddo being good at following directions. Every time you see them following directions, great job, bud. I love how nice you follow directions. It makes me so happy when you follow directions. So much praise. For some, this is easy. For some, this is actually really difficult. If it's really negative in the household and there's a lot of negative talk, it can feel kind of awkward to start shifting their language. So making sure that they find the wording that's appropriate for them and that feels natural for them, letting them know that this might feel unnatural at first, but just give it a try. Let's see, if we can see any change together, can be really helpful. So starting with catching them being good, can really help build that relationship and build up some of that positive language, some of those positive experiences. Interested in the chat, do folks use this with families? Has it been successful? Just want to get a sense of what's out there and what folks are doing. I'll give it a second because sometimes there's a delay in the chat. I'll take silence as maybe not. Absolutely, it works. Okay, thanks. So it's been seconds, not just me. Praise approach works well with students. I'm concerned that the family I'm working with won't use it at all. Yeah, they might not, and that's really hard. But I'm still going to try my best to get them to buy into why it might work. Again, set that expectation that, hey, I don't know if any of these strategies are going to work. Really, we don't. Every kid is different. Every family is different. But I know it's worked with other families. I know what the research says that it's helpful. Let's give it a try. And if they don't, there's still other things we can do, but we do want to just see if we can get there with folks. Yeah, or with our own kids too. All of this is very helpful with our own families, by the way, absolutely. Okay, so that's one strategy is praise. I'm going to go over quite a bunch of strategies. I would advise using one at a time because they seem so simple. None of this is rocket science, but they are so hard. That's another good thing to share with caregivers. This might sound like nothing. It sounds like this is what you're telling me to do when my kid is acting out like this. And it sounds like it doesn't match. But I promise you'll see as a caregiver, this is actually kind of hard to do. And it's harder than it seems. Easy concept, hard to implement. So we want to try one of these kind of strategies at a time. Okay, another strategy that we have here is special time. This is helpful for young kids, especially. So in that, like, we're talking about school age kids, maybe those like 6 to 8, but it's also helpful with 10 to 12-year-olds. I've seen it work with those as well. There's a lot of negativity going on in the house. We want to create just a little bit of time that feels different. Again, we want to create developmentally appropriate expectations. I'm not expecting that if I teach you this strategy, you and your kid are going to get along great, like, after trying it once. But what I'd like to try is a few minutes a day, maybe 5 minutes a day, maybe a couple days a week. I know caregivers are so busy. So if it's one time a week, I'll take it. For 5 minutes, I'll take it. Ideally, if it can happen like 4 days a week, that would be great. Maybe just on weekends might be more feasible. Whatever works for the family, we'll take. Let's try this strategy called special timeout. So what it is it's 5 minutes where the caregiver and the kiddo are playing together and it's just positive. The caregiver is not really asking questions. They're not giving commands. So like, do this, do that. They're just having a nice playtime with that kiddo where they are fully, totally, completely present. That's really hard in the modern daily lives of families. And so even just doing that 5 minutes a day, if it's 10 minutes, that's great. Doing that a couple times a week, a couple minutes a day can be really helpful, I think, for families. Some tips around it, we want to pick out toys to use in special time that are interactive, right? So things like blocks or coloring or cars, Legos, things that you can do with the kid, right? No, watching TV, there's not a lot of interaction, there's not a lot of talking happening. Reading a book is fine, but there's, again, not a lot of talking and communication. We want to build those positive interactions. I kind of enjoy hanging out with my mom during this time. That, I don't feel like that all the time. So that's what kind of special time can feel like. So I see a question and I'm just going to address it here because it seems relevant. So Francis asks, how long would you suggest to try and stay on a strategy? Some parents will try for a few days or weeks and say it doesn't work. That's a great point. So I would try, it depends how often you're seeing the family. It depends what kind of role you're in. Some folks on here might be working in schools and maybe having more access to caregivers. If I'm seeing a family once a week as a therapist, I would say, let's try this strategy out for homework. Come back next week, report how it went. We might have to tweak it and then you'll try it again. Or we might be like, okay, we're going to move on. That wasn't helpful. Maybe we'll try something else and then come back to it and bring it back. So it really, I hate this answer, but it really does kind of depend. If they're really oppositional, like that was terrible, it didn't work. I think to keep that buy-in, maybe moving on to another strategy might be helpful. So really kind of understanding where the caregiver's at. I think a week is a good amount of time to try, but also letting them know the expectations. So some of these might work for a month and then they stop working. Letting caregiver know that too is helpful. So at the front end, I always say, these are tools, especially if your kiddo has ADHD. Some of these skills might work for 2 weeks and be so great, and then all of a sudden they stop working. Letting them know that at the front can be helpful for setting those expectations. So for instance, I hope that helps that question a little bit. If not, we'll maybe have some time in the end to talk about that. Great. Some helpful ideas from the crew here. It works like a charm for resource parents. That's really helpful to know, who had never had it in the home before. So that's really great. If they've never done special time, it can be a really nice experience. Definitely with those younger kids, it can be a real win. Nicole, that's a great point. So modeling. So oftentimes I'll have to model these skills, and that can feel, like maybe I shouldn't have to do that, but it's really helpful. So I'll model with caregivers. Okay, this is what it looks like. Like, tell me the toy you're going to use. Let's practice it out here. This is what it sounds like. This is the language I would use to set it up. Hey, so we're going to have this thing called special time. It's going to be really fun. Here's a timer for 5 minutes. We get to play together. Which toys from this section do you want to choose? So modeling that to caregivers can be helpful. The more structure we can provide, the more likely they're going to do it. So if we say, okay, it sounds like you're really busy. How do Tuesdays at 4 p.m. work? Let's find a time. Don't let them leave your office without having a day and time that they're going to do. The more specific and structured we can get the activity to be for that caregiver, the more likely they're going to follow through. Okay, so we've got that labeled praise, catching them being good. We've got special time. Those are some things that really help, that we want to start with, that help build the relationship. Again, that's a really important piece when we're doing this work. So moving on to another kind of area that's impacted, another developmental area that's impacted by trauma is self-regulation. So I think oftentimes we hear things like, my kiddo's not able to calm down, they can't reset after getting upset. When they don't respond well when they hear no, all of these things are kind of clues that this kiddo is having a tough time regulating themselves. So if we think about self-regulation, what it is, it's being able to identify my feelings. I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling worried, and then being able to adjust them. So I'm feeling worried, what can I do to feel less worried? That's self-regulation. As with attachment, as with all of these developmental skills that are learned for kids, they need caregivers to model this for them. Again, for kids with trauma, maybe they haven't had that, right? It wasn't a very regulated environment that they were in. Again, that's psychoeducation to help parents understand why we're seeing these behaviors. So when caregivers do reflect and model calm behavior, kids gradually learn to internalize those skills themselves. And that's a big part of how self-regulation develops. So that modeling that you guys have mentioned in the chat, it's so incredibly important for caregivers to recognize that they're such a model for their kiddos, right? So let's talk about some strategies that can really help with kind of self-regulation. Okay, I see there's more questions too. I just want to make sure I get through some of these skills and strategies, so I'll make sure to address that towards the end and leave some time. All right, so self-regulation, kids really dysregulated. What can we do? We talked about in the beginning that fight, flight, freeze response. When you notice that behavior that's really big and out of nowhere, and maybe it's that fight, flight, freeze, this can be helpful. This strategy, I think, is really helpful when we think kids are in a trauma response, or when kids are just having those big behaviors and they're just really dysregulated. The only thing we can really do is model calmness here, right? A lot of times what caregivers will do is engage, and what we need to do is move back. So when you're working with a family, or when you notice a kid's having explosive behavior, they're really dysregulated, this is what I would coach parents in doing. The first thing you do is create a sense of safety. Move back from that kid, stand a few feet away, and speak in a calm, quiet voice. I can see you're really upset. We want to reflect that emotion back. I can see you're feeling really overwhelmed and you need some space. Sometimes you can offer doing a coping skill together. They might not engage in that. That's okay too. Is it okay if we try some deep breaths together? And then just really the only thing to do is allow that child to calm down. And that really means backing away and being quiet, not using a lot of language here. We want to stay close enough so we make sure that child is safe. When we notice that child's in an explosive, potentially trauma triggered response, all we can do is really model that calm until that child regulates. Then we can go in and talk about the behavior, talk about the feeling. But when they're in that response, we talk about it as like their thinking cap has kind of come off. they're not in a place to hear things. They're not in a place to use coping skills. They just need to relax. And so what the caregiver can do to not feel helpless in those situations is to really model that calmness. Again, modeling this with caregiver can be really helpful too. Teaching relaxation skills to kids can be helpful. I could spend a whole 2 hours on this, so I'll just provide a couple of examples here. When kids are doing that 0 to 5, it's helpful for them to understand what that looks like. So sometimes I'll create like an emotional thermometer with my families, doing that with the kiddo and having the caregiver understand that as well. So sometimes rating your feeling can help make it feel less. So this kid's showing a lot of emotions. Caregiver says, wow, I can tell you're really angry right now. How big is this anger? 0 to 5. Even that conversation can help bring the situation down when that kiddo is really responding big. It kind of shifts them out of whatever they're in. So using a rating of a feeling can be very regulating for kids and helps make them feel more in control of those emotions. Labeling the feeling is really big. It can help, again, kids feel in control of those emotions. So I'm feeling angry and it's this big. Again, that's all modeling self-regulation. Grace shared teaching I statements to both the kiddos and the parents can often increase that sense of self-regulation and support that positive communication. Absolutely. So I'm feeling, not like that, not assuming what someone else is feeling. That's really great. I know you have these slides, so don't feel like you have to take all these notes, but these are just some popular relaxation apps that can be helpful. We're talking about school age kids, so this is really more for that older, like 11, 12-year-old kids who have phones on them. This can maybe feel a little bit cooler than belly breaths or other things like that. So sometimes using these relaxation apps can be helpful. Okay, so we've talked about self-regulation. Again, some strategies to use during that time if folks are really seeing that that's the kind of main concern. Another one for self-regulation is routines and rituals. So this is really important, especially after a trauma. So creating a routine around the activities that are tough. Again, we're talking about self-regulation. We're talking about trying to help kids feel calm, feel regulated. Routines, rituals, so helpful. We know this for ourselves too. When I'm overwhelmed or when I feel dysregulated, like making a list, having a routine. Okay, on this day, it's going to be hard. This is how it's going to look for me. All of that is very regulating. It's regulating for adults and it's regulating for kids. So how can we do that? Again, with caregivers, sometimes I'll say is, again, tell me a time that's really tough in the house. Tell me a time that feels really out of control. A lot of times it's morning and nighttime. Homework time too can be really hard for families, transitions. So let's specify when we're talking about. The more specific we can get, the more likely they're going to try it out. So it's not just like try and create routines. It's morning is really tough. Let's create a specific routine around this hour in the day, and maybe that can help. Again, as specific as possible. So routines, I'll show some examples of that, and that might be helpful to kind of just show caregivers. Again, thinking about the specific time in the day, where you want to work with them around creating the routine. We're talking about kids who have experienced trauma. So there might be some rituals around triggering events or things that might be helpful to put in place. Again, we won't know all those triggers, but we might know some. So there might be a certain date, an anniversary of something, Mother's Day. There's all these different things that we know and can anticipate. This might be a tough time for my kiddo or this kiddo. And so what can we put in place to make that day feel a little bit more structured and regulated? Coming up with that with the family can be really helpful. And then the last thing I think that's really important for self-regulation is choice. I think this might be the biggest tool that can make such an impact for caregivers. After a trauma, the thing that's taken away the most, if you take away one thing about what trauma is, it takes away kids' sense of control. When I wasn't in control, something really, really bad happened. So I need to be in control. and I need to feel control. Also, we all just like to feel control. That's a normative experience for all of us, particularly for kids after trauma. So when we provide choices for kids, it helps them to feel more in control. So whenever possible, I'll work with caregivers and say, let's think about how we can offer choices to them, even if they're really small, right? So, no, we've got to do this, but we can either do this or this before that. Which one do you want to do? We got to wear clothes to school. which clothes you want to wear? I'm going to take out 3 and you get to choose which one. Whatever the situation is, hopefully they're wearing clothes to school, but whatever the situation is, how can we provide either forced choice or some choice so that kiddo feels like they're part of the process, right? So that helps build self-efficacy, but also that regulation. So routines, rituals, choice. Here's just some examples, and you can just Google on the internet too, examples, samples for families. I think a helpful thing for buy-in is to have resources and giving it to the caregiver. So, oh, you'd like a routine around morning time? Here's one. Why don't you try this out? Or let's make one in session together. If they're going to have to make it when they get home, that's just one more barrier for them to actually do it. So again, when is it going to happen? What time is it going to happen? And here, let's make it together so you don't even have to do anything when you get home. That can be really helpful. And you can make it however you want it to look. It can be really fancy or it can be really simple. You can make it be really fun, a routine. So let's try and, get our routine done. Last time we finished it in 30 minutes, let's try for 25 this time. So these are just kind of like helpful ways to try and get something that's a really challenging time in the family to feel a little bit less stressful. Okay, and then pairing it with rewards is very helpful as well. So with those things like routines, I really like to use behavior charts with families. Some families have a lot of feelings around behavior charts because they probably tried them and they failed. That's fine. I find them to be incredibly helpful if we kind of tweak a couple things. You guys might have experience using behavior charts with families. They're really popular. I know probably at school your kids are having charts, reward charts, behavior charts. So they're not unfamiliar to families, but I find that if I'll talk about some just helpful tips and tricks to make them even more successful. So for me, when I'm creating a behavior chart for our families, again, I try and think about only a few behaviors. So I don't even let, for the most, if we've got a behavior chart with like 15 behaviors on it, who's following through on that? That's really hard. We want to keep it really simple, a couple behaviors. And then I like to throw in a behavior that the kid already does really well. So in this example, this kid loved to make their bed before school. So I'm going to throw it in there because I want them to earn it. I want them for this to be successful for this family and this kid. Because if we make it really hard and they don't earn it, the behavior chart means nothing. Why would I do this if I'm not getting anything out of it? We need them to earn the reward the first time so that it's rewarding for them, right? That makes sense. So let's kind of rig it, if you will, so that they can earn it the first time, and then we can progressively make it more challenging and progressively try and meet those goals that the caregivers are looking for. So those are just kind of some tips here. We also want to have a plethora of rewards because for kids, especially for kids with ADHD, as we're talking about disruptive behavior, picking out a movie may be really interesting and the next week it means nothing. So the more rewards you can have, those are helpful. Having the child come up with the rewards, that can be really helpful too. Again, all of these kind of little things can make it so that it doesn't fail that first time. Here are some examples for younger kids. The kind of tip here that I like is reminders. So because I put on a piece of paper, taking medication doesn't mean they're going to take medication. But if I give them a reminder, maybe we'll make it. Maybe we'll make it so that they can do it. Again, there's a reward that they can earn, which is really exciting. That's very reinforcing. And maybe we're making it realistic. So I'm not going to expect that they just take their medication with me saying it once, but maybe if I give them a reminder, I remind them of the reward, it can be more helpful. So this might look like Jamie, remember we're working on this behavior here. You really want to earn those stickers at the end of the day today. I asked you to take your medication, you didn't. That's one time. You have one more chance to be able to take your medication on your own so you can get that yes. So that can be helpful too for kids. So the reminder, setting it up like that, it's a bit more tricky for caregivers to follow through. If you have those that are really involved though, and really want this to work, this can be helpful. The other tip here is choosing a daily reward and a weekly reward. Again, it seems kind of complicated, but putting these little things in can be helpful. So Jamie gets to earn if she respects other people's things, takes medication as instructed, keeps hands to self. If she earns 3 yeses on Monday, you don't have to be perfect. They get to earn a reward that day. But if Jamie just blows Monday, and Monday's a tough day, there's still an opportunity to earn a reward at the end of the week. So all is not lost. So that keeps kids motivated. So these are just kind of like tips to help these behavior charts be successful. Rewards are interesting. I think some families feel mixed ways about them. I try and come up with rewards that are not monetary, that don't cost anything for families. So these are just some creative examples that you can come up with. So when you're thinking about rewards, okay, we really want to work on following directions the first time. Let's come up with a chart. We'll put it in the living room so that me and kiddo can see it, and we'll put the rewards on there so they can see it. What rewards do we want to use? Time alone with caregiver is a nice one. Time with friends, maybe having an overnight, that's like a big one. That's like a weekly reward, or like if they earn like 2 weeks or if they earn enough points. Extra time on their phone, 5 extra minutes of TV. Some of these things are non-monetary. I really like the time with the caregiver one, especially if you're trying to build that relationship. So these are just kind of some creative examples that folks can use. I hope we're not, I noticed there's a lot. These are a lot of strategies. We're almost at the end of the strategies, I promise. But I find these to be the most effective. And these are the ones that tend to be in all of the evidence-based parenting strategies for working with caregivers and kiddos who have difficult behavior. Okay, so active ignoring is one. This you'd want to use with caregivers when it's those kind of like mildly irritating behaviors, but not huge. So we see these a lot. So the kids rolling their eyes and caregiver can't stand it, but let's pick our battles. Maybe we can ignore that. They're flopping around on the floor. It's kind of annoying, but no one's being hurt. Maybe we can try and ignore that. So there are some behaviors that we can ignore. These behaviors are like mildly irritating and typically attention seeking. So if we ignore that behavior, it will go away. So I'll talk about how it works. These are kind of behaviors that I would recommend trying out active ignoring with your caregivers that you're working with. So maybe like arguing if it's incessant, and the caregiver can do that. If it's like sulking and pouting, whining is one, asking questions repeatedly, or asking the same thing over and over again, like a mild tantrum. These like smirking, mocking, those are things that will raise your blood pressure, are not necessarily harmful, and are oftentimes seeking attention. So how do we do this with a caregiver? I would say this is I'd introduce it as this is a skill. It's called active ignoring. It sounds really easy, but it's actually much harder than you'd think. It sounds like you're not doing anything, but you're actually doing a lot. It's not passive, it's actually very active. Even though we're not doing anything and we're taking away attention, we're actually doing a lot. Here's what it can look like. Ignoring means 100% of the time you're ignoring. When we've identified the behavior that we're going to ignore, so I'll work with caregiver. Okay, let's try one behavior that week that we're going to ignore. Again, we need to start small. Let's practice it out. So no consoling, no like, I told you not to do that anymore. We're silent. We are ignoring. We walk away. we busy oneself, the kid's following, we're walking away. And then I want to tell caregiver what to expect. So when we try out the strategy, typically you didn't ignore this behavior and it escalated. It got, typically it got its attention, right? So you didn't ignore, something's happening, like kiddos flopping around the floor and you're like, stop flopping, I've told you so many times. They're getting attention for that. When we're ignoring that behavior, what we're going to see is going to increase. I used to get attention from caregivers around this, and now I'm not. I got to amp it up. So letting caregivers know that this is going to happen, that this behavior is going to amp up, is very important because they'll just give in. So make sure that they are committed to ignoring, or it's going to turn on us. But what will happen is if we're ignoring the behavior, it's not that fun anymore. It's going to go away. And as soon as that behavior stops, as soon as that kid just like stops flopping around on the floor and is really still, wow, hey, I love how nicely you're sitting so quietly. Let's go do something together. What we're doing here is we're paying attention to the behavior we want to see, we're ignoring the behavior we don't. So again, for this, I would probably try these one at a time. So I'm starting with praise, I'm starting with special time. I feel like, okay, like the relationship has really built. I think I'm at a place where I can offer some additional strategies. Maybe I'm putting in some routines, maybe I'm trying a behavior chart, or maybe I'm trying active ignoring. I'm going to try these one at a time for a little bit of time. We're going to practice it, we're going to tweak it, and we're going to get parents to feel comfortable with it before moving on to something else. Because again, it can feel really overwhelming to try these, to do these, and for these to be successful. I'm going to throw out this question to the group because I've heard it from other helping professionals. So just want to check in and see how folks are feeling. We are talking about kids who've experienced trauma, maybe they've experienced neglect. I wonder if there's any concerns you think caregivers might have around using ignoring, or if you've tried this, have you heard any concerns that caregivers have about ignoring their kids' behavior? You guys can throw it in the chat. I'm just interested to see if anyone's had that. So ignoring crying. So I'm not sure if I agree with ignoring crying. Yeah, that's a really big one. Absolutely. And it might not be, it's not often appropriate, right, to ignore that. So it really will depend. It's hard to tell if crying is attention seeking or not. Either way, that child's letting you know that they're not okay. And so being able to go over and support that child is helpful. Oftentimes, I haven't had that experience where another behavior that I'm ignoring leads to crying. It usually leads to more of that behavior and then a burst of that behavior and then extinction. But for some families, crying, it won't be acceptable to ignore, and I understand that too. Okay, let me just try and get to some of these here. It can be taken as you don't care. Yeah, maybe they're worried that the child's it's gonna cause more hurt. Absolutely. Concern causing more harm. The child might escalate and the child might get aggressive. Absolutely. So we don't want to ignore any behavior that is harmful. We only want to ignore behavior. If the child does start to escalate to something that's aggressive, we definitely want to intervene. So it's a tricky one, right? We want to get at this before. And if the family has really serious concerns that like my child will escalate and get aggressive, then maybe we don't want to try active ignoring in this situation. Sometimes it can be absolutely very helpful. So maybe asking caregivers, what are your concerns around doing this? For some families that have that concern that the child might not take it well, and it's just going to escalate things, I personally like to have parents go over active ignoring with the kids. So, hey, I'm going to be trying this thing. It's called ignoring. I don't know, you can give it a name. And when you do this, this is what's going to happen. Or when the child starts following that caregiver around, asking repeated questions, like attention seeking in that way, a caregiver has called it their own timeout, or they'd let them know like, I'm ignoring, and then they'll keep ignoring. And so you can let the kiddo know that you're doing it. Some caregivers that really works well, for others it doesn't. So it really just depends. Lots of good thoughts here. Yep, some child might think parents are in agreement with that behavior. Absolutely. And so what we want to do is, as soon as the good behavior is seen, we want to pay lots of attention to it. That really tells the kid, all right, I'm getting attention for my good behavior, right? Mom is walking away from me as soon as I'm acting like this, but as soon as I stop, I get all the attention. And that helps me understand that this is what gets mom's or dad's attention or caregiver's attention. Okay, so there seems to be lots of fears around this. And so I think it's always good when you're starting out any strategy with caregiver, tell me how this fits for you. Does this fit with your family? Does this feel like a fit? What would make it fit better? What are some of your concerns around it? Let's talk through those concerns. And then again, there's more of a chance that they're going to actually try it out. All right, so we've got a little bit of time. I'd like to end a little bit early just so I can get some of your questions. But I'm going to throw timeout out there. I like teaching timeout to families. I find it to be really helpful. There's a strong evidence base that timeout is very effective. I would never start here. I always start at the beginning with building that positive relationship. If there's not that positive relationship, timeout's going to be a real mess. So you want to really assess for if it's appropriate, but I find that it can be really helpful for some families that are having those more extreme behaviors. So behaviors that pose a safety risk are the ones that get a timeout, and they're very specific. So working with caregivers to determine what specific behaviors get timeout. If everything gets a timeout, that's very exhausting for everyone and it's not going to work as well. So example, caregivers worried because their child's running into the street, or they're breaking things in the house, or they're hitting their sister. These are behaviors that the family deems unacceptable. Every family is different. Obviously, I think a lot of families would deem this unacceptable, but this is what we're going to kind of structure timeout around. So every family does it differently. I'm just going to throw out some kind of tips that I find to be helpful. Obviously, we want to, I think, work with caregiver in session to figure out, okay, how are we going to do timeout? Let's make sure we really understand before we try the strategy. Where in the house are you going to do timeout? What does that space look like? How long is timeout going to be? It's going to be, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I would never do it longer than that. Let's explain the procedure to the child. So in session with the caregiver and the kiddo, I'm saying, okay, let's talk about timeout in the house. This is what we get timeout for. This is where the timeout area in the house is going to be. I'd have the caregiver show them the timeout area. These are the rules of timeout. Explain the rules of timeout. So it's not just this like in this huge moment of anger and stress, you're starting to explain this timeout. We really want to prepare for timeout ahead of time. Trying to help caregivers understand that they should be calm before giving a timeout command, and making sure that that family can follow through. So if you're in the grocery store and something's happening and you can't follow through in a timeout, it's not the time to give a timeout, right? Again, I can spend probably 2 hours talking about timeout. So I know I'm going through it kind of quickly, but these are just some kind of tips around timeout that I think can help make it successful. These are just some sample language for caregiver to practice about how to give a timeout so they're not giving it in such an angry way. Some kids have reminders, some kids don't. You can make those decisions with that caregiver beforehand. And this is how to do timeout. Don't say anything during the timeout. Don't respond when the child says anything. Don't provide any reinforcement during the timeout. It's really timeout from attention. And then ending timeout. I oftentimes go over how we get out of timeout with a caregiver. Not the best time to talk about the behavior that just happened. So did you learn your lesson? Maybe, maybe not. We just want to serve timeout calmly and get out of that situation. Emotions may still be high. So after the timeout, we really just want to praise them as soon as we can. So your timeout's over, you served timeout. Maybe they were whining, crying during timeout, or trying to get your attention. We ignored that and they stayed in the timeout area and they did their timeout. As soon as they get out, we want to praise them for doing something good and bringing that positivity back in. They won't go to timeout. These are just some helpful tips and tricks. I think for very young kids, some guided compliance can be helpful. Timeout doesn't start unless you're in the timeout area. I think that's a really, really helpful one for kids that won't go to timeout. Timeout's 5 minutes, but it doesn't start until you're in the timeout area. So they're essentially in timeout till they get to timeout. And you can create a rule that if you serve timeout really well for 2 minutes, that's all you, like, we can reduce the time. So there's all these kind of tips that you can use, and you guys have these slides too. So all of these are on here as well. So I thought timeout wasn't recommended. Time in is recommended. Yes, so yes and no. I think timeout is a recommended strategy and is an effective strategy. If parents are doing timeout on its own, that's the only strategy you're using, it's not going to be effective. If you don't do positive discipline strategies first, and you don't have that positive relationship, and you're not creating this positive relationship and space within the home, timeout's probably not going to be effective. If that kiddo is right after a trauma experience and there's a lot of fight, flight, freeze, and there's a lot of those, can't manage those behaviors, and we're noticing those big kind of trauma reactions, I'm not going to go to timeout, right? I'm going to go to modeling calm and providing coping skills. There's so many other things we can do. However, in certain circumstances, when there's that positive relationship, when that caregiver is trying all these good skills with you and they're working, when there are these behaviors that are pretty big, like hitting or destroying property, we've already worked on following directions and all those other smaller behaviors. When all of these requisites are kind of here, I do think timeout can be very effective. Some people are really turned off by the term timeout. We can call it whatever we want, but essentially all we're doing is removing attention from something. We've done it before. We've done it with ignoring, we do it with other things, but we're just removing attention from the negative behavior we don't want to see, making sure there's a lot of positive behavior happening in other places. Can timeout be called taking a break? Timeout can be called anything. If timeout is triggering for folks, and for good reason, I absolutely understand why it might be. Timeout's also been used ineffectively or inappropriately before, so I definitely get that. Calling it something else can be very helpful. Having the kid call it something, safety time, whatever we want it to be, coming up with that can be really useful. I noticed the time, so I'm not going to spend too much time here because I noticed there are some questions. But the other two kind of developmental areas that are impacted by trauma are self-efficacy and social connectedness. So self-efficacy is the belief that we have control over our behavior, oftentimes and our environment. And as you can imagine, after a trauma, kids do not feel that way. They lost that sense of control. We've talked about this, but I'm going to reiterate, control is that biggest thing that's lost after a trauma. So any opportunity that caregivers can have to provide that sense of control helps create that sense of self-efficacy. I think I would argue that a lot of the strategies that we talked about promote self-efficacy. We're helping kids to, earn rewards, meet their behavioral goals, know that they can do that, know that they're able to control their feelings. All of that helps increase that sense of self-efficacy, which is so important developmentally for children, but also for kids after trauma. And then the one thing I'll say about social connectedness is oftentimes I hear that a consequence that a caregiver gave will be taking kids out of soccer or play dates or social events. It's a discussion with the family, but generally I would say, especially after a trauma and for kids with challenging behavior, it can be really hard to make friends, be really hard to have positive social interactions. And so I would be hesitant to have those be the first things folks take away as a consequence. Even though it was a really bad week, being around pro-social peers in a positive structured environment like a sports event or a swim thing can be really helpful for kids. So just be mindful if the consequences that are always being taken away are those social ones. The more we take kids out of pro-social activities and isolate them, the more deviant those behaviors are going to be. So just be mindful about making sure that we're not totally taking away this child's social connectedness to others. Again, that also helps with regulation and self-efficacy and all these other developmental milestones we're talking about. Okay, so those are all the strategies. We've reached the end here. I just have some recommendations. These are for caregivers. I like to provide these reading recommendations if caregivers would like more information. Of course, Caltrin's so wonderful. They've put them all in your chat to like get the link to. These can be helpful. I like these for caregivers if they're looking for more information. Jess mentioned in the beginning that ACTS Project is a project that I'm the director of. We have a website, actsproject.com, and we have a lot of resources there. And so we've got resources that we've kind of whittled down. I find that these are helpful. We have some resources for parenting after a trauma. If you have caregivers that like to read these, some will, some won't. And their own caregiver trauma. So we didn't unfortunately have time to get to that, but a lot of times, you know, we know intergenerational trauma is very prevalent and that caregivers will have their own trauma. So how do they take care of themselves? That might not be in that wheelhouse for you to work with them on, but maybe there's some resources for you to get that. PCIT is amazing. All of these things come from everything I shared comes from every behavioral parenting strategy out there. So I've done, I think, most of them, and they're wonderful. And these, I would say, are just some of those core components that come from them. Okay, so I'm gonna, well, I can't see you guys anyway, so I'll keep my screen up here. But before we end, I'm just gonna take a quick look. Okay, so questions about timeout, not surprising. What happens if they won't stay in the timeout area? Really quickly, for young kids, what some caregivers have told me has been successful. We're not talking, we're not engaging, no attention, but I might gently guide that kid back to the area. That can be helpful for some. For others, we create a rule. Obviously, a rule of timeout is staying in the timeout area. If they follow the rules of timeout, let's say you have a 5-minute timeout, the timer's right there, they can get a reduction of timeout. So now they can get, now timeout's only 3 minutes. So it's a little bit more motivating to stay in the timeout area. So that can be kind of helpful. Ages, I would say it's a good question. I'm skeptical to say a specific age. I say young kids are a timeout can be really helpful for. You know, for teenagers, I wouldn't call it timeout and it would look very different, but it's a similar principle of removing attention. There would just have to be some tweaks, but I would say generally for the population that we're talking about here for school age kids, I think it can be helpful. Okay, so I think we're at the end here. So thank you guys so much. Hopefully you have access to the slides. Hopefully some of these strategies can be helpful in the great work that you all do in a really difficult area. Working with kids who have experienced trauma is difficult, and then adding on behavior problems is really difficult. So good luck out there with doing this work, and hopefully some of the strategies can be helpful.
Melissa, we just want to say thank you so much to Dr. Melissa Bernstein for your time, for your expertise, and I'm sure you'll start to see the emojis popping up on the screen, and you'll also see that in the chat, all of the thank yous. So for those asking, there's a couple things I want to remind you is that you will have access to a survey. That survey will give a link at the end of it to a certificate of attendance. Also, there will be a copy of this recording sent to your registration email within 2 days of today's session. So we'll try to drop that survey once or twice, but as you can see, we will try to kind of squeeze them in between all of the thank yous. I heard someone say, please let us know when she has more workshops, right? I feel the same way. We are always on the hunt for some Dr. Melissa Bernstein. And we would also remind you that you can follow her on Twitter at Dr. Mel Byrne. All right, let's see. Other than that, I see a question about, are we sharing slides? The slides were dropped at the beginning of the session. They'll also be included in the 2-day follow-up. Just keeping an eye out for any additional questions y'all might have. I don't see any coming through. Again, thank you all so much. Thank you again for being with us and sharing your expertise today. And we will see you all again very soon. Have a great day, everybody.